Welcome, colleagues, to this CG's seminar number 173, and it's a very interesting topic today, putting the university to work, technology-mediated extraction of land and labour from UK universities. And we have as our principal presenters, Mariya, Ivancheva and Brian Garvey, and Yanya Komeljenovic from Lancaster is going to come in and give us a commentary at the end of the two main presentations. Before I introduce our two principal presenters, let me take you through the web protocols in the usual way. Webinar is being recorded. It exists for all time, preserved on YouTube, and the chat will also be available. Both will be posted on our website, the Centre for Global Higher Education website, in the next 48 hours or so. Now, when we're in the webinar, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or you want to ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. It makes it more personal for everyone. We recommend using speaker view so you can more clearly see the person talking. To ask a question, use the chat function. Put your question in writing in the chat, and we'll select from the questions in the chat when we compose the Q&A section. If you come in early, you're almost certainly going to be part of that Q&A discussion. Our experience has been that sometimes the best questions come in the last 5 minutes or so, and we can't always fit them in at that stage. So do raise your issues early and do indicate your willingness to speak when you do so. When the Q&A starts after the main presentations and Yanya, when you're invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from before you say what you want to say. At this point, I will move to the main part of today's activity. We've got Mariya, Ivancheva, and Brian Garvey. Now, Mariya is a sociologist and anthropologist of higher education and labour, and a lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Her academic work and research-driven advocacy focus on the casualisation and digitalisation of academic labour. No lack of empirical material there, Mariya, I would suggest. Very important topic now. And the reproduction of intersectional inequalities at universities and in labour markets. Her full bio is on our website. Brian Garvey, who will follow Mariya, and I think, Mariya, you can bring Brian in when you're finished, is a lecturer at the Department of Work, Employment and Organisation at the University of Strathclyde. And he teaches and undertakes research in labour and land commodification for primary production linked to the carbon and green economies, with a focus on deepening inequalities within and between Latin America and Europe. He's currently got an ESRC grant as principal investigator, which is looking at the question, so who is building sustainable development? A good question to ask. Yanya Komeljenovic, who will follow the two speakers, is a lecturer in higher education at the University of Lancaster and a valued CG researcher who will be speaking also next week, Yanya. So you have two goes in, next webinar, in fact, in 2 days' time. So you'll be speaking twice this week. Mariya, the floor is now yours. We look forward to what you've got to say.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thanks for the invitation as well. And thanks to Trevor for the technical support. In fact, Brian and I are not going to speak we are going to speak one after another, but we're going to shift because this is a paper which we present, which we did together. So it has been submitted for publication. And what we've now tried to do is to put a lot of text into a few slides. So bear with us. I'm going to share my screen and I hope that works. Let me see how it goes. I suspect you see it.
It's working, Mariya. Yeah.
Okay, great. So the title, Putting the University to Work, Technology-Mediated Extraction of Land and Labour from UK University. And so, this is a paper that had its own history, and it comes partly from my and Brian's involvement, and that of a lot of us here today and in the UK university sector, in the UCU strikes in 2019, 2020, which in March 2020 ended with the mass spread and outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, which also resulted in a push online and towards hybrid teaching by now, which has not receded, but it has been presented, and one can see as an opportune moment for universities to experiment with what many of them or their senior management wanted to do already before the pandemic, which is to introduce online learning in order to achieve a mass scale of especially student recruitment. This paper itself is not based on empirical research that we've done together, but it is based on different pieces of empirical research that each one of us has done, and with our involvement in local branches of the union and interest in labor relations, especially with view of social reproduction, unbundled higher education and academic precarity. And then the other thing, what we're trying to do in this paper is to refocus a bit the current debate around especially the digital turn, so to speak, in higher education, because a lot of the work that is coming out these days focuses especially on learning and teaching in a very cognitivist way. There is a lot done on research and metrics, and there is now a growing number of works, including by Anya, on the role of capital and assets especially. But labor is usually left outside of this debate, especially when it comes to digital technologies. So the questions that we wanted to answer with this paper are two, like first, how are academic workplaces and relations of production organized to facilitate the entry of new technologically driven public-private partnerships towards the streamlining of the university? How are universities being put to work by public-private agreements? And then secondly, what ways do divisions of labor in academia and real subsumption of teaching with the entry of digital technologies affect the organization, security, quality, and experience of academic labor? And how is resistance being engendered or suppressed in the digital university? And now this is Brian's turn.
Thanks, Mariya. So to place this paper and our work,
Brian, did you freeze?
We've temporarily lost Brian, but I think he's at the point of saying something important, so we'll
yes,
bring him back.
In fact, he was about to quote Marx. It is
yes,
a
indeed.
dramatic
nice
moment.
Nice quote.
Brian, perhaps if you hear us, maybe switch off your video to see if you can come back in.
Yeah.
And if not, I will. Oh, okay, he's back in. So we didn't hear you. Can you continue?
Brian, we lost you when you were about to give us the interesting quote from Marx.
Can you hear me?
We can now, yes. Excellent.
Okay. That's not the first time that would have happened.
Yeah, it's the digital transformation of academic discourse.
So we're turning to the concept of subsumption when we're discussing what was happening. And as Mariya had said, we've been discussing this both as, I suppose, academics interested in subject, but also as people who'd been active in our universities and branches through a dispute, and trying to make sense, not just of some of the particular challenges we're facing at work as we move to a phase of lockdown, but also how it was very evident that the unions were struggling really to deal with the complexity of some of this. And so I felt, we need to try and understand what's happening better, be able to articulate that a little bit better, and then also, I suppose, take an active position in thinking about how a better analysis of what's going on at this moment in time can maybe inform action, in terms of collective action, and how we as academic workers actually deal with some of these complex issues that branches and universities in Scotland and England, Wales and the north of Ireland were experiencing. So I think it's helpful to turn to this quote from Marx back in 1867, that machinery sweeps away every moral and natural restriction on the length of the working day. The most powerful instrument for reducing labour time suffers a dialectical inversion and becomes the most unfailing means for turning the whole lifetime of a worker and his family into labour time at capital's disposal for its own valorisation. And I recognise that some of these concepts and analysis are being revisited, not just in terms of the knowledge economy or academic labour, but the fact that across economic sectors, people are finding that more and more of their domestic time or family time is being encroached on and kind of in competition with the working day and working time, is leading us also to visit subsumption in relation to academic labour. And so this isn't something that's confined to the knowledge economy. So for example, if we go into a supermarket now, we're becoming more and more accustomed to machines doing the work where previously you would have had 3 or 4 staff checking out groceries. But the fact that we're doing that in our own time means that the labour doesn't appear. The labour is still being done, but that's being done by us when we're not actually formally working for a salary. But energy we're expending and the value is being created as a result of our work, not as workers in this sense, but as consumers. So this trend and this commodification of more and more of our own leisure time is something we have recognised in terms of academic labour, and leads us to thinking about formal subsumption and real subsumption in trying to separate what's going on and how to address it. So following from Marx divided subsumption into formal and real subsumption. So in the former, he would have posited that, for example, a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, under formal subsumption would trade their labour for a salary and hence enter the wage relationship. But under formal subsumption, the actual activity, the work that individual, that man or woman would do, doesn't really change in terms of the process of doing the work. The difference is that individual is receiving a wage for that and therefore enters into the capitalist mode of production. So from that, he moved on to distinguish that from real subsumption, which would follow that new technologies and very often new machines would facilitate new divisions and hierarchies, would actually change the labour process itself. So as well as perhaps extending the working day or shortening break times for workers, what became less and less important was actually the use of that butcher or baker or candlestick maker, and more the value that labour was creating. And under new systems of organisation, for example, then he recognised that by changing the labour process, more value was created for the owner of production, very often at the expense of those doing the work. So the Fordist mode of production would be a fairly classic example of this, whereby workers on assembly lines were, I suppose, being stripped of what their own intellectual capacity would be in the world of work, and through modularisation and compartmentalisation, a division of labour and division of tasks, steeply hierarchical as well, that the whole labour process is changed, and the value of that labour is really only what is returned to the owner of production. So I think it's interesting revisiting these concepts in relation to academic labour, because I suppose with the breakdown in the Taylorist or Fordist mode of production, and the recognition that there was value to be made from cognitive labour, from the intellectual capacity of individuals, it's not necessarily the case that, for example, academic workers are just subjugated to the machine. So in fact, there is a value to be created from innovation, from creativity and inspiration. But the way that value is created causes some challenges for capital to be able to capture. So it's not the fact that it's easily modularized in terms of per unit hour that somebody works or per kilo that somebody lifts in a sack in terms of what returns the value. So there's interesting tensions then between how we perform our work and the outcomes of that and how that's commodified or subsumed. But what I think the past few months have done in terms of this acceleration of platform technologies being introduced into our campuses, as Mariya had said, this isn't new. The process had begun long before, but the proliferation of digital technologies is facilitating a change in how our work is valued. It's bringing up some new divisions in terms of how our work is organized and performed. And of course, then has big implications for how our work is experienced and our own subjective experiences of that. And what we're recognizing increasingly then is that this, of course, doesn't just affect us in our working day, and there's changes in our working day and how the university is organized that Mariya is going to come to. But of course, it's having big implications in our sphere of social reproduction, if you like. And that area of our working lives, we would argue, hasn't been adequately, considered in the literature, even that's revisiting issues of subsumption within the knowledge economy. And it's necessary we do so to understand what is happening, but also to think about how we more creatively confront some of the challenges that are in front of us. So with...
Shall I? Yeah, maybe just to add that there was like in this, let me just finish this slide and then I'll give you the word again, Brian, sorry. I think here what we're trying to do as well in terms of the higher education literature and the literature on academic labor in specific is to think that like the formal and real subsumption also help us think about the difference between research and teaching and how they have been stratified, and one has been subjugated to the other one, and how teaching, which is the main care work and community building work, is mostly absent from a lot of literature on academic labor that's related to metrics, rankings, and the new pressures of new public management, but whereby there is a stratification between research and teaching, which sometimes the academic literature on even on formal subsumption, and I'm thinking now of Christian Sadkowski's work, has been mostly neglected because it focuses mostly on how our research is transformed and not how our teaching is transformed. So Brian, you again.
Okay, so that's a bit of a theoretical background to how we developed the paper that we produced together. But I think just to bring us up to where we are, it's helpful just to look at some of the big changes in UK public higher education, beginning with, I suppose, the post-war social democratic settlement, where we did see a massification of education and greater access to higher education. Again, and importantly, from the theoretical context we're looking at, it's recognised that a lot of higher education is subsidised by the public sector in producing a workforce that is able to fulfil the needs of the economy, is a certain gift in terms of the employability, of a workforce and a labour force that obviously creates value for the economy. So that's been studied before, but I think it's interesting to bring that up to date about how some of the new public-private partnerships are changing those dynamics, and as we've called it, streamlining the university to ensure that value is returned, not just to the university owners, but more and more to private companies that are investing in them. And to get us to that stage, we can see a gradual change, over decades in terms of higher education, the introduction of new public management systems and quality control in terms of universities, introduction of fees brought in to replace what had been block grants to institutions, so a greater reliance on teaching from fees, the increased competitiveness of research grant funding, also the different lines of funding that are made available, very often market and industrial led. So the change to the post-92 university sector through the Higher Education Act of 1992, expanding the higher education sector. And then, as we know well, linked to this, new quality assessment controls. So research selectivity exercises, REF, TEF, an example of these that we know only too well. And linked to the introduction of fees, various acts that changed and increased the threshold for paying fees and the full cost fees that have sequentially increased over time. So with that, of course, there's new discourses. Students increasingly talked about as clients or customers, universities to provide value for money, employability skills. Some of this has been covered in the literature mentioned here on the slides. And increasingly, what we're seeing is the entry of private companies and providers. So the university and its role within the economy, but also within the city as a key area of real estate and investment and innovation districts that we're seeing that Mariya will come to in a little bit. We see universities as an interface. So the universities may be the owners of real estate and producing value through innovation, through creativity, the intellectual value of academic labour. But of course, finding new ways to capture that, which is something I'll come to. And with that, changes to the university core business. So more emphasis on fee income, on international fee income, research fee income, and then changes to how teaching takes place, supervision, design, student support, and the separation of this from research, which is again something Mariya will come to. But then again, consistent with this discourse is what we see as the marketization of higher education and the insistence that it continues to roll out a surplus and that the value created and the profit emerging from the sector becomes more important over the last decades. And we see that the fact that there's a 44 billion surplus in higher education, yet many of us in higher education were out on strike in 2018 to defend fairly drastic and radical pension cuts. And we know the situation in terms of pay below inflation pay rises. At the same time, while it's generated the surplus, student debt has escalated. And now a staggering 58% of faculty are casual staff. And a more and more emphasis on universities being able to finance up to 3/4 of their own capital expenditure from their own reserves, more than double what it was in 2015. So that gives us some of a backdrop to the contemporary situation that we find ourselves in, and it's something Mariya is going to turn to now.
Yeah, so now I'm gonna flip through because we are slightly running out of time as well, but the way that in the paper that we're discussing, we see formal and real subsumption and the way that it is facilitated by technologies at our universities. So starting with the formal subsumption, what we see most than everything is extraction of rent. And it's happening on many levels. So it is not just one level which would be easier to trace, which would be just, for instance, real estate, even if it is very heavily involved. But we're seeing first like a triple burden that has been put on the public. That is first the fees that are supporting the core faculty teaching under the new breaking of the core grant to institutions, and a push that comes with it, which is interesting for faculty to teach vocational and employability skills. So one observation that we make in the paper is that while post-1992 universities were turned from vocational training schools into universities, now all universities are turned into vocational training schools with a very big investment in order to create the student as a worker, trained, often fed bite-sized content, especially through the new technological innovation of shorter courses, disrupted curriculum and so forth. That student is also usually highly indebted and becomes a dependent, profitable and compliant workforce for corporations. The public, what is more, bears the risk of student loans that are packaged as debts and sold on to private investors. Research sponsored still predominantly by taxation money is increasingly commodified through, first, as we know very well, metrics-driven, competitive, cyclical funding, which is a huge expense and human resource expense, but it also means that there have been studies about how European funding, for instance, functions. Like a lot of the grants that we put a lot of overtime in are not successful. And a lot of times those who get the grants are the same privileged higher education, elite higher education institutions. At the same time, so there is a big expenditure of human and financial resource into a machine of management that doesn't usually return those benefits. Then the question about the patents of like the production of knowledge for impact at low cost and for high profit of companies. And here I would mention two things. One is the comment of the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research at University College Dublin when I was a postdoc there, who said that the university is proud to offer publicly paid stipends to PhD students that are going to work to a beneficial rate to Google. So they work for Google, whereas they're hired by the university, so to speak, on public money, public resources. So this is something that the public university currently takes pride in, which I find extremely sad and ironic. But then the other question is that increasingly we're seeing, for instance, wherever there is an actual industry academia interface, we're seeing like combinations between, for instance, Google paying to Oxford or Amazon paying to Columbia University for research on ethics or development of artificial intelligence. And so a lot of these are now following from the natural sciences, where before tobacco and drugs and still have been developed for the profit mostly of companies, into now increasingly also social sciences. And what we're seeing as well, which is technologically facilitated to a large extent, is how the publishing corporations are increasingly extracting free labor from us and are selling subscription back to us, and now increasingly not only through subscription, but through golden open access that we have to buy for our articles to appear. And so the last example in this line that I'd like to give is the university anchored so-called innovation districts that are using, on the one hand, university real estate for businesses and startups to so-called incubate knowledge, while staff is pushed out and is put into cubicles, and a lot of precarious workers don't even have space on the university's facilities. At the same time, university staff and facilities are used like an investment credit and as a human resource to fundraise and coordinate such extraction also of public money often. And then especially since the 2008 crisis, when before there was an understanding that universities are going to expand through the money that's going to come from business, but then instead, and there have been studies written about that, universities have become the main ground for fundraising for businesses to be able to stay in operation. And then there is the question of how these innovation districts use staff and student user data to predict consumption, but also to increase surveillance. And on this, Janja just had a very good paper published, which speaks about that in much more details. But then coming to the question of how this commodification on so many levels changes employment is, so the new technologically enhanced divisions and alienation of academic labor. So first we've seen the polarization between research and teaching work, research being seen as profitable, but increasingly relying on fundraising. That means that it takes time and human resource, and the ideal academic becomes a person who is either available 24/7, transnationally mobile, careless manager, or somebody who has workers who can do that for them. So someone who can hire postdocs to collect data, somebody who can buy out teaching staff in order to replace them. Increasingly at UK universities, researchers and data collectors, which is done mostly by PhD and postdocs, these people are not eligible to be PIs on big grants, which means that there is also a redistribution of ideas and creativity towards those on the higher positions. And then the question of teaching buyout of faculty time from projects is also interesting and paradoxical, because students are still lured by the research ranking of universities, but often they come to be taught by not research active, usually precarious workers. Many of those are women and people of color. In the UK at present, there are more than 70,000 atypical contracts, 6,500 on zero-hour contracts, now citing data from recent reports by UCU. And those people who have traditionally been underprivileged in this position, who are still providing most care, on the one hand, at the university for an increasingly anxious student population, but also at home for child and elderly care, are women and faculty from working class origin and Black and ethnic minority ethnicity. So, and then the last bit, which I have written a lot about, but here I have little time to focus on, is the question of unbundling or digital disruption, that beyond this bite-sized content and disrupted curricula has created the outsourcing, deprofessionalization and modularization of teaching. And this is where we actually see the very real subsumption of labor, in which online management providers, program management providers, which have $billion revenue per year, take 50 to 70% of all the revenue, platform rent and data access through online classes, but are relying increasingly first on unpaid teaching by university workers, and second, and this is the kind of dangerous part, on outsourced university educated like staff that is hired by private companies but teach for universities. And here I just want to remind, so on the left hand you can see like this diagram from Bruce McFarlane's paper, The Morphing of Academic Practice, where we see what used to be the academic before doing teaching, research and service, falling apart more and more towards deprofessionalized, modularized tasks, which can be automated to a large extent, outsourced, or, you know, there is a kind of assumption that we are all replaceable. And you can see here the kind of how the gender difference between starting university and ending at professorship is changed. But what you don't see, and also like with white and Black ethnic minority faculty, but what you don't see is that in both cases between research postgraduates and academic staff, there is an increasing bubble of precarious workers who are more and more deprofessionalized, paid at lower rate, and are doing the teaching and carry work, does the social reproduction for the university.
Hi, you can alert me if I freeze again. I'll turn the video off. But I just conscious of time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the next couple of slides, because I would welcome questions and discussion. And I saw a few comments in the chat, so we'll try and respond to these as I'm bringing us towards a conclusion. I think what's important in response to this slide and also some of the comments in the chat, there are tensions around this, of course, you know, and the purpose of our analytical framework is to highlight that there are, of course, you know, there's relations and tensions and contradictions with the whole move online. So what's driving universities to embrace technology, of course, is to see if they can reach more people, increase their market, increase their brand, and reduce costs. At the same time that private companies are always anxious to get in and utilize what they can from the university sector, also for the same reasons. But at the same time, universities have to be very aware of students, you know, and their experience and what they'll come for. So we did have the ironic situation where we were being told, even in the early stages of lockdown, that universities were very keen to see what opportunities were coming from us being forced online, and we knew what that meant. But at the same time, they knew if they said to students that they were going online completely, then a lot of students, particularly those from overseas, would not enroll, because therefore there's nothing would differentiate that university or that university brand or what would be special coming to that university from anything that you can click online, learn from, deliver, and get a certification from a lot more cheaply. So it's important to say that these issues that we're talking about are contested, but we do think we, as academic workers, should be more informed and forthright about our own demands and protecting our own labour and our own academic labour. It is there are some particularities that are coming through from what Mariya's presented. So the fact that how we create the high value work, the research and the innovation, isn't always easily compartmentalized, and therefore there's a lot of tension right now, actually, how universities capture the property of our work or our performance. And it's quite interesting talking about the performance of our work, because of course, if our university is anything to go by, the fact that we haven't yet agreed a terms of reference for how our performance rights can be licensed and guaranteed in a way that's satisfactory to us at the university, outlines that this is a key battleground of the commodification of our work. So intellectual property already has been won and granted to universities. If we're employed by them, our work becomes their property. What remains is us standing on the shoulders of jazz musicians, rock musicians, journalists who fought for decades to ensure that they would get something right from the use of their image, their audio or visual material. And that's really where we are at the minute. It's not just our struggle. It's been fought by some of the worst paid artists in the world. But very interesting. So the actual performance or work is really at the forefront of its commodification, and the will of universities to want to get access and ownership over these performance rights to create further value. So there are things that we can do. And for example, I don't see why already, unions haven't provided their own forms that we as staff within the law can sign to protect our own work, our own knowledge, intellectual and performance rights. So what we've learned is that with this acceleration of online provision, we have been caught wrong-footed, not really prepared for new challenges that haven't conventionally fitted within collective bargaining agreements. The fact that people are segregated and segmented now, people are working from home, the remote access and absence from campuses has also allowed universities to bypass some of the standard collective bargaining negotiations that we would expect when there are big changes to your terms and conditions. And our terms and conditions have been changed radically, and changed not just in terms of how we perform our work, but how it encroaches in our own domestic time. And I think this is the interesting, I suppose, transgression between formal subsumption, where we are valued for particular work, and increasingly how this modularization of our work, how digital technologies are facilitating a certain process where we're having to engage with machinery and technology increasingly, and there's a certain discipline and a change in our labour process as a result of that. So I'll conclude there, by saying that there are changes that have been present for a while, but have really accelerated and presented particular challenges for us as academic staff at this moment in time. And I would argue our unions haven't been that much different to others in not really getting to grasp just about how the political economy of the 21st century encroaches on our time of social reproduction, and hasn't focused enough on what happens beyond what's been understood as a standard working day, and how those boundaries between the working day and our domestic time has been transgressed, and how actually we start to organise to understand the subjective experiences behind the figures that have just been presented there by Mariya, and how collectively then we can consider a more informed collective response to these challenges in higher education. So, Mariya, I'll let you conclude, yep?
No, I think we're done here. I'd rather take some questions and Janja's comments at this point. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Mariya, and thanks, Brian. That was really solid. And Janja has the first commentary. After Janja, we'll bring in Nick Hillman and the others who are raising things in the chat. Janja, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Simon, and thank you, Mariya and Brian, for your presentation and the paper. I should say I've had the privilege of reading the whole draft paper, so thank you very much for sharing that with me in advance. So I should say that thank you for the very refreshing analysis. I really appreciate your focus on the academic labor and the role of technology in this, which I agree is seriously lacking in higher education research. And I really like that you're placing the analysis in the broader context, which is external and internal to higher education. So in terms of external context, in general, the changes to work, gigization, so gig work, if I can call it like that, and digital platforms as labor intermediaries, or even governance, new governance of work. And then internal processes to higher education, which have to do with marketization, privatization, and new forms and types of public-private partnerships. So you really kind of brought everything together in something of a magnus opus, which might at the same time also be a bit of a problem, because it might need a bit more unpacking, just what has to do with sort of like neoliberalization and consequence of that, what has to do with technology, what has to do with pandemic. Sure, they all interact, but just how can we at least analytically think about these different effects? So I have one additional thought that I had while listening to you, and two maybe more challenging questions, as one should have. So the additional thought that I have is just a general shift towards education as a service. So now it's not really uncommon that we hear, you know, higher education or education as a whole turning into a service like Netflix and so on. So financial investors have been talking about this years ago, but now it has become more tangible, especially in the pandemic. Now, the education technology is fast expanding and the value of it is rising, so that at the moment it's worth around 200 billion, and by 2025 it's predicted to rise to more than $400 billion per year. Now, what the industry predicts are two sort of sources of this value. One is that there will be more students because there will be more people entering higher education, but also reskilling of the work population, so lifelong learning. And the second reason is just the increase of spending on the digital, which today is around 3% in education, and by 2025 they predict will be 5%. So obviously, if we have limited funds, if you increase somewhere, you have to decrease somewhere else. And then the question is just where and how. I guess labor costs have to do a lot with that. But then on the other hand, how it relates to the cost savings and what are then the future financial flows and their structure. So the empirical analysis of this will be really interesting in the coming years. Now, two more challenging questions. One is, while I sympathize with your attempt and the line of the analysis, the question is just to what extent are these reforms actually happening that you mentioned? So distance education, has a long tradition, and it's not only about the redistribution of money into private firms, so through for-profit MOOCs and OPMs. In fact, for-profit MOOCs are a tiny bit of the whole MOOC landscape in the world. And in fact, it's also about the actual transformative power of education. So a lot of online provision actually demand students to engage with disciplinary knowledge, as Paul Ashwin says, is in fact what counts as transformative potential. So, you know, I wouldn't necessarily dismiss all of this important aspect of the role of higher education anyway. And also, what do we have with the open source platforms? Because not everything is private. So the question then becomes, what's the relation between these different platforms, which some are for profit, but not all, and the universities, and then different contractual actual agreements between them. So, you know, if I really simplify, who should you to negotiate with universities or platforms or the combination, or what do we actually have here? And it seems to me it's really important that universities actually have the capacity to manage their relations with platforms as well. And the capacity is technical, legal, and financial. So I'm afraid that not all universities are in the actual, that they actually have capacity and power to properly manage the relationship with their platforms, yet alone then with the staff on the other hand. Now, the second group of sort of comments is around your whole analysis being based on the Marxist critique of labor exploitation, which on the one hand is fine, but you invoke the question of value extraction without the actual analytical and theoretical attention to where value comes from in the digital economy. And I think you can't really avoid that. So you do mention intellectual property rights, but more in the passing than the actual center of your attention. So here I think it's also very different whether we use platforms for work or using platforms for leisure, as you mentioned at the beginning, Brian. So, and also if we use platforms for work, we create two kinds of value for our employers. One is monetary through wage labor, basically the value that we deliver with our work, but then also speculative value through the digital data that we leave behind, and then what's happening with this data. Yeah, Simon, I'm just a minute to bring it all together. So, so really, I think that you need to put more attention in the changing value construction in digital economy, which moves away from commodities to assets and from prices to rents. So, and one final bit is if you put digital platforms in the center, just which labor is being exploited. And I see your point of focusing on academic labor, but we also have a lot of workers working for platforms that might not necessarily be exploited, but they are important part of the ecology of digitally delivered higher education. So I have a lot more to say, but I will stop here and conclude with saying great work, and really thank you for bringing much food for thought for all of us.
Well, colleagues, so thank you, Janja. That was terrific. I mean, clearly this webinar will repay reviewing, thinking carefully about everything that's been said. Now, we have very limited time, and it is a webinar, and I do want to open it up to the others. I know that Mariya and Brian would like to immediately comment on the substantial points that Janja has made. Save up those responses. I want to bring 4 other people in. Let's hear from them in order, so that you get a chance at the end to do that difficult thing of trying to cover what several people have said. But I think that time-wise, you know, we're at 2:49. Time-wise, that's what we have to do if this is going to function as a webinar and not a 3-way conversation only. So can I ask Nick Hillman to come in? And after Nick, we'll have Zach Spire, Morten Hansen, Neil Stewart, and possibly David Law if we can. Nick.
Thanks very much, Simon. Yeah, I mean, thanks for both the speakers for getting my thinking going. I mean, I've got to say, I really enjoyed what you had to say, but I was sorry by what you left out. I mean, I didn't hear a single positive statement about modern higher education, which I think does lots of really good things. I didn't hear anything about professional services staff. I didn't actually hear an alternative to the world that you're criticizing. Maybe there was a hint that, you know, fund our sector through vast sums of public money, but it's not what voters tend to vote for. And I also don't see it happening post-COVID. So so I don't. There was a lot you said. I'm afraid I disagreed with. It made me think that critiques from the left do tend to be more interesting than critiques from the right, but I'm not sure that makes them more correct. But I wonder if I could just ask one specific question, which is the one thing I've put in the chat, which is, if it's correct that this shift to tech, as you both said, the beginning of your remarks, is sort of more in favor of the managers than the workers, if we must put it like that. Why is it that the workers and the students, their representative bodies, the UCU and the NUS, have called for a bigger shift to online learning and a cancellation of all face-to-face teaching in the crisis? Whereas it's the managers who are trying to get everybody back on campus and giving them a real life experience. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Substantial discussion there, of course. Zach Spire. Zach, are you there?
Yeah, good morning, colleagues. Thank you so much for this. This presentation was brilliant, especially as someone coming in from the United States, where Scott Galloway at Columbia University has proposed a number of instances when Google, Apple, and Microsoft would move into the digital space and digital higher education. And I'm wondering, as we debate the measuring of labor and the measuring of value and the measuring of how our work is counted, how do we count our work, and then how do we sort of propose that or justify that as you are proposing through our sort of existing mechanisms, UCU being one of them, in order to justify who owns what labor? How do we define our labor? And also, if I may, and finish up, how do we delimit that definition? So I don't want to say everything I think and everything I do whilst I'm sitting in an office belongs to the university that I'm a member of. I'm wondering if there is an alternative where we actually begin to draw boundaries around what spaces and what we do to count. Thank you.
And thanks, Zach. Morten Hansen.
Hello. Yeah, I just want to also say thank you very much for the presentation. When we think about the transformation of labor, it also implies that there is a new capitalist class coming. So can we talk about who are these new capitalists, and what are some of the ways we should and shouldn't conceptualize that, and what would be some of the potential dangers when we start that analytical work? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Morten. Neil Stewart. Neil.
Thank you. A very good and stimulating presentation. And I think you highlighted a lot of the negative consequences of some of the higher education developments. I was particularly startled at the percentage of casualisation. I hadn't realised that it got that bad. But I felt that your presentation was overly negative. First of all, we're having a seminar for free, built on the shoulders of capitalists and other people who've built some of these platforms. And it seems to me that there's a lot of positive things about this new world, not just the negative ones. I thought in particular, and have done for a long time, that you're wrong about the funding of student finance. Student finance is one of the biggest redistributive mechanisms that's been developed in the public sphere. In the 1990s, those of us who were political advisors had the dilemma that the public appetite for direct taxation had reached its limit. And how was it going to be possible to get the people who owned wealth in the middle classes and above to share more of the public burden? And the student loans and finance system, with all its flaws, has proven to be one of the biggest mechanisms. And I'm always startled by the fact that people do not understand this. Go and read all the Charles Clarke stuff, etc. But what is the settlement that you would want? The other contradiction that you have is, on the one hand, you plead for universities to be institutions of public good. And then at the same time, you try to insist that some of the value created should be owned by you, the individual academics, as though you were performance artists. Isn't that a contradiction in itself? And just leave you with this thought. A number of years ago, I was interviewed on the shortlist to be the General Secretary of the University and College Union. And I certainly wouldn't have accepted these kinds of arguments if I was developing a negotiating position.
Simon, you need to unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Neil. And there's obviously an autobiography of interest there. David Law and Lynn Newen have told us that they love working hard. I'm afraid I'm probably in the same category. Self-exploitation, my family calls it. David, would you like to tell us this, but don't take too long. We haven't got much time left.
Okay, just quickly, Simon. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, colleagues, for a stimulating discussion. I guess that there's a lot that I can be sympathetic about there in terms of the university's position in capitalist market economies, but that's as an entity. When I think about myself, and I've worked in higher education for a long time, was retired for a few years, didn't like it, was tempted back into a position in a university. I think about my own history, my subjective history, which was one of always wanting to learn. And it was a great surprise to me when someone was prepared to pay me to learn and then to teach and to research. I'm sure this is a kind of forced consciousness, but I suppose I prefer my Marx from the 1840s and not from the 1860s. My question really is can you reassure me that I've not been deluding myself all my life?
Thanks, David. We've also got Philip Vostel and Lynn Newen on the call list, but I think at this stage I'll have to call it to a halt and ask our speakers to respond to the many points that they've just heard.
Oh, I was wondering if Philip can shoot his question quickly or not, but he already switched off. So
please respond. I think at this stage it's now 3 minutes to.
That's fine. Brian, do you want to go first and I'll go next?
Sure. It's going to be a bit of a challenge to to cover all that very briefly. I'll try and link some of my response together. Janja had pointed out the issue that, you know, there's, for example, been open education provision through online platforms, and so it's not, you know, that we've taken a position that, you know, technology bad and no technology good. I actually don't think I disagree with what Jan just said, and in fact, I think the performance rights and intellectual property and our own ownership of our labour is connected to both Jan's point and what Nick and others pointed out as well. And it's not a selfish ownership or patent or copyright of our labour, but it's the fact that the universities have got a challenge in that the way we're able to have this discussion today, it's correct, technology has enabled that. And indeed, given new technologies, then higher education and our sharing of knowledge could be free to everybody who's got an internet access. And so there's a big challenge for the universities and the providers to make sure that that can't happen. Otherwise, they can't create value from the work that we're delivering. Because if education was a public and free good, which I still believe it should be, and that's a political position, and that also then means why I disagree with fees in terms of what should be a public good. The fact that the knowledge we create as education providers, as academics, can and could be free at the point of delivery, and technology could enable that. So what we're pointing to is that the different ways that both the universities and providers are trying to capture our labour to create value that's not necessarily in the interest of the students. And by goodness, there's not too many students coming back with very favourable responses after digital and online learning has really been a symptom of a pandemic, and not something that 4 or 5 months after just online provision, students would be rushing to. On that point, students had the sense a few months ago to resist a face-to-face provision because it was dangerous. And the higher education sector is now at risk of lawsuits because they had deliberately told students that they should come onto campus and invited international students from abroad to attend classes to make sure that people would pay their fees and the numbers wouldn't go down. And that was a risk, and it was a gamble, and it backfired because students didn't want to put themselves at risk. So we should be careful not to conflate the two things. We're not the situation the students took, and you're right, the unions took, you know, and we and as the trade unions took as well, is that because of COVID we should be teaching online. But that shouldn't be conflated by saying that universities were rushing to face-to-face provision over the heads. Sorry,
maybe I can take it there because we already are running out of time. So I'm just going to comment very briefly on a couple of points. Why did workers and learners want to stay online? Because we wanted to save lives. Why did managers wanted to put us back to campus? Because they wanted to gain money and not to have dorms empty, because they are you know, interested in not breaking their contracts with some providers who have been given rights to construct on campus land and are given the rent over, you know, dormitories. So it wasn't an interest in education, it was an interest in sponsoring the private sector. There is a new class in higher education, and there is a war in this, like in higher education, class war, for sure. It is interesting if we just say it's a class war between managers and academics, it would be missing the point, because there is a whole rank of highly paid, headhunted, you know, VIP academics garnering a lot of also benefits, who are turning on their own workers through the contracts that they offer, through agreeing on conditions with funding agencies that are completely expensive labor. Are the loans a redistribution of public money? This is ridiculous. I'm really sorry to say that, but if it is anything, it is redistribution of dependent and indebted workers into the hands of the private companies that are hiring people who then have to also get credit for a mortgage and so on and so forth. So we're speaking of a huge bubble that the whole higher education loan system represents. And I think to say that this is a redistribution to the public is just, you know, out of question. Who do we speak to? That's again interesting question, Yanya. And you know, who is used to negotiate with? Oh, there is already a kind of quite clear division between what our employers do, and I think it was what became very clear in the UCU strike when it came to pensions. So our employers, represented by UUK, Universities UK, were ready to jeopardize our pensions and leave the whole future of people working their whole life into the hands of the market. So I think, you know, in a certain way, you're seeing dividing lines there that are very similar when it comes to procurement of platforms, when it comes to procurement of data of students and so on and so forth. So I think the dividing lines are very clear. Why unions are not up to speed with them, this completely escapes me, except to say that, you know, obviously unions have also been co-opted and there is legislation that is also tying their hands, but I think it's also the more bureaucratic structure and how unions are functioning at present that makes it very difficult for them to react to this immediacies, and also because they're so dependent on the fee-paying members who are usually permanent academics, they're not really interested to support vulnerable academics that move places often and outsource academics that are outside of their domain. So I think our own task at present is to press them to be interested in this issue. Thank you.
And thank you, Mariya. I mean, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Yanya. This very interestingly, it was not our largest webinar today in terms of participation, but everyone stayed in. And then there's so much richness, isn't there, when you start to break open higher education and knowledge in terms of Marxian political economy. And, you know, there's so much that those intellectual instruments can do, I think, to illuminate the nature of the sector. But there are also many controversies and issues of interpretation. And we just didn't get enough time to really explore so many of those avenues. And, you know, we would have needed a day to do most of that. But you really did open up a lot of questions and a lot of insight for us. And I hope that we'll be able to continue some of this discussion in our webinar program. And I'm thinking, for example, in relation to the nature of publishing and knowledge work and the extent to which that's beginning to look more and more like wage labour through the general system. And then there are many issues. Student financing and loans and so on have been better canvassed than most, but there's I think the harder conceptual issues are related to knowledge and the nature of knowledge work and where that fits in. Thanks again. We will have you back, I hope, and let me invite everyone to join us in 2 days' time to hear and see Janja again and others at the discussion of the Centre for Global Higher Education's next 3-year program. We have 205 sign-ups, and obviously that's going to be an interesting webinar, even though it's just about us, really, us, the research centre itself. But hopefully it's about what the research centre does, and it's also about higher education and what we can do with research and scholarship on higher education to illuminate it and find points of purchase for collective and individual agency. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing everyone in 2 days' time.
Thank you.